There is a bottle in almost every hardware aisle in this country with the word mold on the front and a verb attached to it. Kills, destroys, eliminates. And on the right kind of stain, that bottle does something genuinely impressive. Spray it across a dark patch on a bathroom ceiling, wait a minute, and the dark goes away. The surface looks new. It feels like the problem packed up and left the building. Now the part that does not fit. The Environmental Protection Agency, writing its own homeowner guidance on cleaning up mold, states that the use of a chemical or biocide that kills organisms such as mold, chlorine bleach for example, is not recommended as a routine practice during mold cleanup. And in the same body of federal guidance sits the sentence that quietly takes the floor out from under the entire product category. Dead mold may still cause allergic reactions in some people, so it is not enough to simply kill the mold, it must also be removed. That is a federal agency saying in plain words that killing was never the assignment, which is a strange thing to absorb if you have ever stood in a closet with a spray bottle, watched a stain vanish, and walked away feeling like you handled it. That story is one of the most common in this entire subject, and it almost always ends the same way. A couple of months later, the patch is back, a little wider than before, and now the wall feels soft under a thumb. So here is the standard I am holding every product to today, and I want it on the table before a single brand name comes up because a criterion you hear after the verdict is just a rationalization. One question: does this product take the growth and the material it is feeding on off the wall, or does it push water into something that cannot be dried in place? That question only becomes decisive because of one physical fact about the wall itself, and once you know it, half the aisle stops making sense. Standard drywall is a gypsum core wrapped in paper, front and back. That paper is cellulose, and cellulose is food. When people say mold is growing on drywall, what is actually happening is that mold is eating the paper, and the gypsum behind it is holding the moisture that made the meal possible. The growth you can see is the top of something with roots running sideways through a sheet that behaves like a sponge with a schedule. Soak that sponge and the core softens. The paper loses its grip on the gypsum and the panel starts to sag and delaminate. It does not recover. Gypsum that has been saturated does not go back to being the board that came off the truck. The Gypsum Association, which is the trade group for the companies that actually manufacture the board, publishes guidance on assessing water damage. Its position is unsentimental. Board exposed to water should be replaced unless the moisture source has been identified and eliminated, the water was clean rather than contaminated, and the board can be dried thoroughly before mold growth begins, which in practice means somewhere in the range of 24 to 48 hours. When there is doubt, the guidance says replace it. That is the manufacturers talking about their own product. One precondition, and then I am staying on products for the rest of this. None of what follows means anything if water is still arriving. A treated wall with a live leak behind it is a wall on a timer, and every product in this video is a way of resetting the clock rather than stopping it. Find the water. Stop the water. That belongs to a different conversation, and it comes first. Now, the aisle. The first one is the one your grandmother recommended, your neighbor recommended, and roughly half the internet still recommends. Chlorine bleach on drywall. It leads this list for one reason. Its failure is the best documented failure in the whole category, and almost nobody standing in that aisle has ever heard about it. Household bleach is well over 90% water. That is not a manufacturing flaw. That is what the product is. Sodium hypochlorite dissolved in a great deal of water. Apply that to a paper-faced panel, and you have delivered a chlorine molecule that reacts fast and stays near the surface, riding on a carrier that soaks straight through the paper and into the gypsum. The oxidizer bleaches the pigment out of the growth, which is why the stain disappears so convincingly. The water goes deeper and it takes days to leave. That is not a theory somebody floated on a forum. Researchers working with the EPA ran the experiment. Kelly Ford and Mark Menetrez inoculated gypsum wallboard with Stachybotrys chartarum, painted some samples, wallpapered others, left some bare, let the growth mature, then treated everything with 8 different commercial cleaners and disinfectants and watched what happened next. Their finding was that the 8 products achieved limited success in retarding regrowth when the treated wallboard stayed in the same moist environment. The samples that did better were the ones that got dried after treatment, which tells you something specific about where the actual work was happening, and it was not in the bottle. The verdict on bleach is that it changes the color of the problem and adds water to the substrate. And if you use it anyway on hard surfaces where it does have a legitimate role, the safety branches are not optional. Ventilate the area and exhaust to the outdoors. Wear gloves and eye protection. Never mix it with anything, which I am going to come back to because that particular mistake has its own place on this list. The second entry is what the first one became when it moved into a trigger sprayer. The ready-to-use mold and mildew removers, the bathroom sprays, the spray and walk-away bottles designed so that you never scrub anything at all. The active ingredient here is often the same hypochlorite, sometimes at a lower concentration than the jug, and the chemistry is not the interesting part. The delivery is. These products are engineered around dwell time. The instructions tell you to wet the surface completely, let it sit for several minutes, and in many cases to reapply if the surface dries before the timer runs out. On glazed tile, that is a reasonable design. On a paper-faced panel, you have just been given step-by-step instructions to keep an absorbent material saturated for a quarter of an hour. The published work on this is worth knowing. Menetrez and colleagues tested 13 separate antimicrobial cleaners on gypsum wallboard contaminated with Stachybotrys, following each product's own packaging directions across several different wallboard surface types at high humidity. Some products performed better than others in the lab. The conclusion the authors landed on was that current recommendations calling for removal and replacement of porous building materials should be followed. The study was not designed as a takedown of anyone's brand. It was designed to find out whether surface treatment is a substitute for taking the material out, and the answer came back no. Verdict: right product, wrong surface, and the label's own instructions make it worse rather than better. Third is the one that feels like a solution because you can see the result from across the room. Mold-resistant paint, mildew-proof coatings, encapsulants, and the fungicidal primers sold specifically to be applied over what is already growing. I want to be careful here because this is a case where the manufacturers are being straighter than their customers are hearing. Read the actual directions. Zinsser's Perma White line, which markets itself on mold and mildew-proof performance, tells you the surface must be clean and completely dry and that existing mold and mildew should be removed before painting. Even the primer sold under the name Mold Killing Primer, which is registered with the EPA as an antimicrobial coating, carries directions requiring that gross filth, overgrowth, and loose material be physically or mechanically removed before application, and that the substrate be free of slime and excessive moisture for the coating to adhere and perform. So the product that advertises itself as the one you can paint straight over a problem still tells you, in its own directions, to take the problem off first. And there is a second layer under that. The industry's mold resistance claims for coatings and panels lean on a 4-week chamber test that runs at very high humidity against a small set of organisms and scores how much of the coated surface gets defaced. That test measures whether growth can establish itself on the film. It says nothing about what is happening under the film on cellulose paper that is still damp and still edible. Sealing a coating over living growth on wet drywall is closer to putting a lid on a pot than to taking the pot off the stove. Verdict: legitimate product with a real job used at the wrong moment in the sequence. Use it after removal and drying or do not use it. The fourth entry sits in a different category from the 3 before it. Nothing on the shelf causes this one. The hazard comes out of a combination, and this is the only item on the list that can put you in an emergency room the same afternoon. Never mix chlorine bleach with any cleaner containing ammonia. Not glass cleaner, not multi-surface sprays that list ammonia or ammonium hydroxide, not some homemade blend that seemed more powerful than either bottle alone. Federal guidance from both the EPA and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration states it flatly: never mix chlorine bleach solution with other cleaning solutions or detergents that contain ammonia, because toxic fumes can be produced. Those fumes are chloramine gases, and the exposure symptoms run from coughing, watery eyes, and throat irritation up through chest pain, shortness of breath, and fluid in the lungs. The same prohibition applies in the other direction with acids. Bleach plus a strong acidic cleaner, and that includes vinegar and the acidic toilet bowl products, releases chlorine gas. This one earns its place because of where mold lives. People fight mold in the smallest, worst ventilated rooms in the house. A bathroom with the door shut and no exhaust running is the single most efficient chamber for concentrating whatever you just created. If you are going to use a bleach product at all, use it alone. use it with the window open and air moving out of the space, and rinse a surface completely before any other chemical touches it. Verdict: a hazard manufactured entirely at the moment of use, and the advice threads keep reproducing it. Fifth is where the label stops meaning what you assume it means, and this one took me a while to appreciate. In the United States, any product that claims to prevent, destroy, repel, or mitigate a pest is legally a pesticide, and mold counts. That claim requires registration with the EPA under the federal pesticide law. The registration process is why a genuine mildew stat carries a registration number and an approved list of surfaces on its label. Here is the gap. The EPA's own guidance on when a cleaning product becomes a pesticide draws an explicit line, and the line is drawn around stains. A product that says it cleans or removes stains from algae, mold, or mildew is making a non-pesticidal claim. It needs no registration because it is not promising to kill anything. It is promising to make a mark go away. Walk the aisle with that in your head and the shelf reorganizes itself. Mold stain remover. Mildew stain remover. Removes mold and mildew stains. Those are not softer ways of saying mold killer. Those are the phrases a company uses when its product is legally a stain remover and the packaging around them is often doing everything short of the actual claim. The enforcement record on the other side of that line is real. The EPA settled an administrative action against a Florida company, Quality Chemical, over products including one sold as Destroy Black Mold Remover and others marketed under names promising defense against black mold. The labels carried pesticidal claims to control black mold. The products were not registered, and the company paid a penalty of $69,520 and stopped producing them. That case is old enough to be a footnote and current enough to matter because agency attention on unregistered and overstated antimicrobial claims has only intensified since. In one recent settlement over the distribution of unregistered pesticides and misbranded pesticide devices, a national retailer paid more than $3 million. And even registration does not get you where the marketing implies. Registered antimicrobials are approved for the surfaces on their labels and for this category that overwhelmingly means hard, non-porous surfaces. Not paper. Verdict: the words on the front are chosen by lawyers and the honest ones are telling you they remove a stain. Sixth is the treatment that leaves the most behind while removing the least. Mold foggers, total release antimicrobial misters, and the fogging services that promise to treat a whole room without opening a wall. The appeal is obvious. A fine mist reaches everywhere, including places a rag cannot. And the physics of that mist is exactly the problem. Aerosolized droplets land on exposed surfaces. Growth on drywall is not only on the exposed surface, the hyphae have gone into and through the paper. A fog lands on the roof of the colony and can do nothing about the body of it. Then there is what stays behind. Fogging deposits the biocide across everything in the room, and it removes nothing at all. Not the growth, not the paper it lives on, not the spores and fragments that already settled on the floor and the contents. Which brings the whole thing back to the sentence this investigation started with. Dead mold still provokes reactions. Non-viable spores and broken fragments are still allergenic material sitting on surfaces you touch. A room that has been fogged and not cleaned is a room where the biological load stayed put and a chemical residue was added on top of it. The EPA's guidance is clear that when biocides are used at all, the area must be ventilated and the air exhausted outdoors, and that the correction of the moisture problem and the physical removal of the mold are the priorities. Fogging skips the second priority entirely and treats the first as somebody else's problem. Verdict: the only entry on this list that adds a residue while subtracting nothing. And then there is the seventh, which is the one people defend hardest, and I want to handle it fairly because the defenders are not fools and they are not shills. White vinegar. It is cheap, it is not going to gas anybody, it does not bleach a fabric, and there is genuine laboratory support for the idea that acetic acid can kill common indoor molds. That is not folklore. What has happened is that a real finding about a chemical got promoted into a solution for a building material, and the two are not the same claim. Household vinegar is roughly 5% acetic acid and roughly 95% water. Look at the criterion again. To do anything at all, it has to stay in contact with the growth for a long stretch, which the vinegar advocates freely admit. The usual advice is an hour or more of dwell time. So the recommended method for the gentlest product on the list is to keep a paper-faced panel wet with a dilute acid for an hour, then wipe it in a room that already has a humidity problem. And notice what happens to the internet's favorite statistic. The claim that vinegar kills 82% of mold species circulates without a citation anyone can produce, and it is a claim about species in a dish rather than colonies inside a substrate. Testing on porous building material tells a different story than testing on ceramic, which is precisely why the EPA-funded wallboard work was done on wallboard. The last thing worth saying about vinegar is that it is not a registered mold-killing product, which means nobody has ever had to prove those claims to a regulator to sell you the bottle. That is not an accusation against vinegar. Nobody markets salad ingredients as remediation chemicals. The claim was built by us in kitchens and comment sections, and then it got handed to a wall that cannot survive the method. Verdict: harmless intentions, wrong physics, and the same water problem in a friendlier package. So what has actually been established here? 7 treatments, and they fail for genuinely different reasons. One is a carrier problem, one is a delivery problem, one is a sequencing problem, one is a chemical hazard created by the user and not the manufacturer. One is a legal definition doing work the buyer never sees. One adds residue instead of removing material. One is folklore built on a real but misapplied finding. What connects them is not that companies are lying. It is that a product applied to a surface can only ever do surface work, and the surface is not where the growth lives on a paper-faced wall, which changes the question from which product to when a product is even the right kind of answer. Federal guidance draws that boundary at about 10 square feet, which is roughly a patch 3 feet by 3 feet. Below that, on a hard surface with the water source found and stopped, cleanup is generally a homeowner task. Above that, or where there has been significant water damage, the guidance says to follow professional remediation practice. Occupational safety guidance divides it further and gets more restrictive as the area grows, moving from an N95 respirator with gloves and eye protection at the small end to containment and consultation with an industrial hygienist in the middle range to full-face respirators with particulate cartridges, disposable coveralls, and isolated work areas above about 100 square feet. The material condition matters as much as the square footage. If the paper is stained through rather than surface marked, if it feels soft, if it tears when you press it, if the growth is on the backside of the panel, the board has passed the point where any product on any shelf still helps. It comes out, and there are people who should not be doing this work at short range regardless of the number. Occupational guidance recommends that infants, people recovering from surgery, people with suppressed immune systems, and people with chronic lung conditions like asthma be kept out of areas adjacent to remediation work. If that describes you, this is a job to hand to someone else. There is a reason the federal biocide guidance carves out an exception for households with immune-compromised occupants, and it is the same reason. Now let me change gears because the 3 things that do work deserve better than being read in a prosecutor's voice. The first one is embarrassingly plain, and it is what the federal guidance actually says to do. Scrub the mold off hard surfaces with detergent and water and dry the surface completely. Ordinary detergent. The point of the detergent is that it lifts and suspends material so it can leave on a cloth, and the point of the scrubbing is that the material physically leaves the room in a trash bag rather than sitting on the wall in a bleached, non-viable form. This is the right answer for tile, glass, metal, glazed fixtures, sealed trim, finished cabinetry, and for intact painted drywall carrying light surface growth where the paint film is still doing its job and the paper underneath is dry and firm. Its limits are honest ones. It does nothing for growth inside the paper, and it will not save a panel whose face has gone soft. Dry the area completely afterward and keep indoor humidity in the range federal guidance recommends, below 60% relative humidity and ideally between 30 and 50. The second is the one that addresses the part of the problem the whole product aisle ignores: a vacuum with a genuine high-efficiency particulate filter. Because killing is not the end point, what is on the floor, on the framing, on the windowsill, and on the contents of the room is still allergenic whether or not anything in it is alive. Occupational guidance places this step specifically after materials have been dried and after contaminated materials have been removed, which is exactly where it belongs. Its limits. It has to be a true sealed high-efficiency unit, not a shop vacuum with a fine bag, because a leaky vacuum redistributes the smallest and most inhalable fraction. It is for dry material only, and it is a finishing tool, never a substitute for taking the material out. The third is for the surface you only meet after the drywall comes off, and it is the one place on this list where a treatment genuinely earns its keep. Borat wood treatments based on disodium octaborate tetrahydrate applied to exposed studs, plates, and sheathing once the board is gone. These are registered with the EPA as fungicides and wood preservatives. They penetrate cellulose rather than sitting on it, and they stay in the wood. On framing that has been opened up, dried, and cleaned, that is a real layer of protection for the structure behind the new board. Its boundaries are just as real. It is a wood and cellulose treatment, which means bare framing, not a finished wall, and not a way to save the panel you already have. Borats are water-soluble, which is the reason they move into wood, and also the reason they leach back out of anything exposed to running water or in contact with soil. Exterior applications need a water-resistant top coat, and the manufacturer directions are specific about not exposing treated exterior surfaces to rain for a period after application. And it does nothing whatsoever about moisture. Treated wet framing is treated wet framing. 3 tools, 3 different surfaces, 3 different moments. Detergent and physical removal for the hard and the intact. High-efficiency vacuuming for what's settled. Borat for the bones of the wall once the bones are visible, which leaves the rule, and it is short enough to carry into any aisle without remembering a single name on this list. Ask what the product is supposed to leave behind. If the answer is a clean, dry surface with the growth and its food in a trash bag, you are holding a tool. If the answer is a treated surface where the material stays, you are holding a cosmetic. Then read the front of the bottle for the verb. Remove, and remove what? If the promise is to remove a stain, that is a promise about color. If the promise is to kill, look for the registration number and the surface list and check whether the surface in front of you is on it. And then apply the one test the product cannot argue with. Is the material under the growth something that can be cleaned and dried, or is it paper that has already been wet? Because on a paper-faced wall, that last question has usually already answered itself, and every bottle in the aisle is a way of postponing the answer. The wall does not care what the label says. It cares what is left in it. Here is the part of this I find genuinely strange, and I would put it to the comments, which of these 7 were you told to trust, and who told you? If the reframe was worth something, a like sends it toward the people arguing about it in a hardware store parking lot, and subscribing brings the next tier down. A parent, a landlord, a contractor, a video, a bottle. That answer says more about how this category survived than any lab result does.